Welcome to DIY Easy Crafts and BergKnifeMaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to make a shark-themed fixed blade knife. Now these little knives are AEBL stainless steel, so they're very corrosion resistant. The scales or handles are cast resin with fossil shark teeth. The project started with the handles. So I used a Total Boat or a resin from TotalBoat.com called their thick set resin. And I'm a big fan of this resin. It's very thin. It allows plenty of time for any bubbles to reach the surface, and you end up with some nice clear castings. I made a mixture of blue and black, and then I also cast some black ones. I let it harden for about 5 days. I added shark teeth, and then I poured clear thick set resin right over the top. I really thought my customer was going to go for the black and blue ones, but he didn't. He went with the plain black ones. I cut out the AEBL while the scales were kind of drying, just on a bandsaw, and I just roughly cut them out. I didn't follow the profile lines, right on the money. I ended up finishing up the profile on a belt grinder with a very coarse grit belt. I think I used the 36 grit belt, and that really goes through the material very quickly. Notice that I use a push stick. That makes all the difference in the world. You can really apply a little bit of pressure without fear of burning your hands. You can let the belt overhang on one side and even do the inside curves, but if you have a small wheel attachment, that's a much simpler way of doing it. I'm just going to finish up the profile vertically on the flat platen. And at this point, I'm probably using a 60 or an 80 grit. And these are all rough grinds prior to heat treating. The next step is I just use some Dyka blue and an edge scribe, and I scribe 2 lines on the edge called railroad tracks. I'm going to use a tilt table bevel grinding jig, and this is a gadget or a device that Jason Northgard and I designed a couple of years back. Very easily allows you to control the bevel, and what I'm doing is I'm just going to grind right down to the first line, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. These particular knives are going to end up with full flat grinds, but I like to do the rough bevels prior to heat treating, and that gives me a nice uniform bevel along the edge that I can just match up to when I finish the flat grinds later. Now, so before I heat treat, I want to make sure that I drill the pinholes, and on these knives I drilled not only holes for 1/8 inch pins, but also holes for 1/4 inch pins. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to end up doing or using, but the extra holes, really help with the epoxy holding on to the handle. The blades were heat treated in a heat treating oven, 1960 degrees, for a whole time of 15 minutes. They were then plate quenched. This is taking them out of the tool wrap, which is used for stainless heat treating. After the heat treating, they went into dry ice. There was sub-zero quench, and then when tempered in an oven, two rounds of 2 hours at 395 degrees, and then they cool gradually. Then I'm going to finish off the grind. So I went to a 90-degree table on my belt grinder with a 60 grit. And then I went vertical with an 80 grit, just to kind of merge and get rid of all of those horizontal grind lines. And the goal here is to end up with a fairly smooth blade, but also a very flat handle area, so that the scales have a nice flat surface to attach to. There won't be any gaps. That's basically what you're looking for at this point. I moved on to electro etching the blade, and I use self-adhesive vinyl that is cut out on a Silhouette Cameo craft vinyl cutting machine. This particular decal is a shark or shark fishing decal that I had made up, and I use electro etching, so I'm using a 12-volt automotive charger. I've got one lead attached to the knife, the other lead attached to the electroplate. That electroplate is wrapped in gauze, and soaked in an electrolyte solution that I make from white wine vinegar and salt. I etch 12 volts, 2 amps, 20 to 30-second increments. Every minute let it cool down completely, or quench it in water to let it cool down. And I etched each side for a total of 3 minutes. So my fear here is I never want it to get very, very hot to the point where some of that vinyl might lose its adhesion. That's the rationale behind cooling it down, every minute. The etching process is pretty straightforward. If you've got a good decal and good adhesion, you usually don't end up with too many problems. So I'm just going to scrape off the vinyl, the self-adhesive vinyl at this point, and I'll use a little sandpaper. I think I had 1500 grit out. And these blade etchings are fairly deep. You could catch your fingernail on them. So it's not something that's going to wear out over time. And that's the first real look at how the blade's going to come out looking. So these are the handles. Like I mentioned before, my customer opted for the plain black. I did glue some white liners on, and then I cut the basic shape of the front of the handles. And then I sanded those down to 320 grit, and then I actually polished those on the buffing wheel before I adhered those, or I glued those onto the handles, because you won't have a good opportunity to polish them once they're glued to the blade. Now I taped the two pieces together and laid the knife on top of it exactly where I wanted it, and I used the knife as my drill guide. I could actually see the holes, the drill holes, in the blade right through the painter's tape that I used to kind of attach everything together. And this worked out pretty well. So I had all my holes drilled, I glued all my pins in place, and I just assembled the whole, all 3 parts all at once, and then clamped this together, and I cleaned off whatever epoxy oozed out with a little alcohol wipe. After that dried overnight, I went back to the bandsaw and removed as much of the handle material as I could, and then I'm going to finish the profile on those handles right back on the belt grinder. It really doesn't take long. Now, when working with the epoxy, you really don't want to use too coarse of a grit. You want to make your life easier when you're going to polish it later on. So if you can stick to 80 and higher, you'd be much better off. I actually do as much shaping as possible right on the belt sander. I'm rounding over that top corner. Just be real careful if you're going to do this. You can very easily ruin a knife at this point. The blade is very close to the belt, so one little slip and you could certainly ruin a blade. But the pro is that you can very quickly contour your handles. I then go over to an oscillating sander, and I sanded a bunch of different grits. I started, I think, on these ones at 220. Then I went up to 400, 600, 1,000, and 2,000. And the trick is to hand sand in between, so you get rid of any of the deeper scratch marks. Then over to a buffing wheel with a buffing compound. And a lot of times it takes me 2 rounds, but this is the finished product. A very neat little fixed blade knife, AEBL stainless steel with full blade etching, and fossil shark teeth cast in clear resin with a black background as the handles. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I would absolutely love to hear a comment in the comments section. And I'd like to give you an invite to join us on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making. And by all means, check out the book that Jason Northgard and I put out a few years ago called Introduction to Knife Making. And you can find that on Amazon.com. Thank you very much for watching.